Hello, everyone, and please welcome Helen De Cruz from St. Louis University. And she works on the philosophy of religion, cognitive science, and experimental philosophy. She co-authored a very interesting book on the natural history of natural theology, which deals with connections between cognitive science and classic natural theology. More recently, she published a book on religious disagreement. And this year she co-edited a collection on philosophy and science fiction. And she's going to talk to us about the role of intuitive teleology in reasoning about biology. Please welcome her, and thank you, Helen, very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm very excited to share this research. So this is a relatively recent research in the sense that it draws on a longer question that's been on my mind, namely, how do intuitions that we have feed into more formal forms of reasoning, and more particularly reasoning in biology and theology and so on. And so today I want to think about reasoning about biology and how intuitive teleology relates to that. And just for reference, a substantial portion of this paper is based on the following paper. It's a paper entitled, "Is Intuitive Teleological Reasoning Promiscuous?" But there are some bits that I added and things that I changed. But nevertheless, if you want a copy of this paper, just email me and I will send it to you, because that's sort of the main inspiration. And the other thing in terms of acknowledgement is that all paintings are by the Belgian surrealist painter René Magritte, and it was quite fun to try to think of Magritte paintings that would fit any sort of situation that you might encounter. Now let's start with some two long-held but somewhat related beliefs. The first idea is that teleological thinking in biology is unwarranted or inappropriate in many contexts. And you see this idea about that teleology is unwarranted or inappropriate. You see it in the history of biology. You see people like Jacques Monod talking about that, like there is a certain domain in which it's okay to think about teleology, but beyond that, you're sort of going outside of the bounds of that. You have other people, David Hull, Michael Ruse has a long-standing research program on the question of when teleological thinking in biology is warranted or unwarranted. So that's the first observation or belief. The second belief is that people have, the second observation is that people have the tendency to think teleologically. And very often the idea is that we tend to think teleologically in inappropriate ways. So for example, you even have biologists who might sort of catch themselves thinking, no, obviously the cheetah didn't evolve so it could grab prey. I mean, that's not why it evolved that way. You have rather a causal mechanistic story involving natural selection and adaptation and selective pressures that would result in this happening. So, but still you have this idea that people often think teleologically in improper ways. And often those ideas appear together. For example, in Kant's critique of practical reason, Kant's critique of judgment. And that continues ancient debates on the role and appropriateness of teleological explanation. So, for example, already in Aristotle and Plato, you see very different ideas about how we should think about teleology, with the Aristotelian model becoming much more influential than the Platonic model with the demiurge. So the aim of my paper is, I want to answer the question, do people really reason teleologically in improper ways? Is that the case? Do we really do that? Now, there is a lot of cognitive science involved in that particular question, so I want to spend some time talking about that. And second, I want to examine implications for the question of the appropriateness of teleological thinking in biology. So once we get a better grasp on the domain of intuitive teleological reasoning, we might extend that to think more about the appropriateness of teleological thinking in biology. My approach in this paper, the main kind of work that I will be looking at, is the cognitive science of religion. Now, the cognitive science of religion is the study of the cognitive basis of religious beliefs and practices. And there are many, many different disciplines involved in the cognitive science of religion. Notably, you have anthropology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, and various other ways, archaeology even, and even philosophy at some point, to think about the cognitive basis of religious beliefs and practices. But uniting this very disparate field is a basic assumption, namely, to understand religion, we have to think of everyday mundane reasoning processes. So religion is not some special domain of human cognition, but it is rather a byproduct of other ways of thinking. And this is an interesting continuity with tradition like William James, for example, with the principles of psychology, going against other traditions like Rudolf Otto, who rather see religion as something very specific. Now, one domain of investigation is teleological thinking. And there is actually one figure who stands out as having done so much to investigate how we think teleologically, namely Deborah Kelemen, and you have a picture of her here. So she is a developmental psychologist. She studies children, and she is interested in how children's cognition develops over time and how they think of explanations. Her work on teleology in children, particularly promiscuous teleology, is very interesting to me. So it's her claim, as we will unpack in a moment, that children think, and even adults under certain conditions, think teleologically beyond what is actually warranted. So that's a normative claim, and we'll look a bit more at that normative claim in a moment. I'm not going to play this video because videos on online seminars, it's sort of hit and miss, but you are welcome to look at this video. It actually, I'm just going to describe, it just shows her doing such experiments where she asks children a variety of questions and to explain how certain things came about, and the children reply in a very teleological fashion. And I'll go into those experiments in a minute. Now, I want to step back just a bit before we go into this cognitive science literature. I want to look at the broader idea of how we can think of teleology and people attributing purpose to things. Like, why would we do that? Why do we use these purposive explanations? Now, you might think, and this is the sort of general bread and butter cognitive psychological explanation. So, for example, here I have a pair of scissors, and like in an actual live face-to-face talk, I probably wouldn't use scissors because it would look threatening. But anyway, here you can look at scissors and say, like, why does it look like that? What is it for? And I can use my teleological thinking to think about these scissors and to think, yeah, the blades are sharp so they can cut all sorts of things, notably paper. This is paper scissors. And it has these two holes because, yeah, we have fingers that are like this and so on. So my teleological thinking is very productive. However, we actually use teleological reasoning in a wide range of contexts. So, for example, you might think, why did this happen? Why did the pandemic happen? And I've seen this online. It happened to teach us a lesson. It happened because we are just ruining the planet. And somehow, we are being taught a lesson that we can't go on as we are. So very common. I see this all the time. Why do we do that? Now, Kant has an explanation for why we have this tendency. And the tendency is called the transcendental illusion. So if you look at the critique of pure reason, and here's a horrible admission. I was 32 or 33 when I finally took up the courage and read that awful book. Like, it's just awful, and it just keeps on going. And it's like, but it's very interesting. So the critique of pure reason proposes, in very general terms, a comprehensive metaphysics and philosophy of mind. And it's still super relevant to cognitive scientists today. And if you had to sort of make cliff notes of 2 pages of the, or even of a page of the Critique of Pure Reason, then I would say, and many Kant scholars would agree that these are important themes, that one theme in the Critique of Pure Reason is that the mind actively shapes and structures experience by several cooperating faculties, notably sensibility and understanding. So everything we experience has a priori elements, that is, elements that our reason supplies prior to experience. Now, Kant made all sorts of claims that cognitive scientists today would find a bit hard to swallow, such as that space and time are also actually our minds that impose that onto the world. But nevertheless, the more general idea that the mind actively shapes and structures experience is pretty much accepted. In cognitive science, it's so well accepted that to try to say something differently, and I know there are contemporary things such as, embodied cognition and 4E cognition and affordances and stuff like that, but nevertheless, the idea that the mind structures experience is still pretty mainstream. But there is also a second idea, and that idea is actually really crucial to the Enlightenment project. So Steven Pinker didn't get the memo, but Enlightenment is really about the limits of reasoning, about how far you can. It's not like, oh, look, we can think and we can do anything. Like this, not. It's about how far can we think? What are the limits of our reasoning? The limits of reasoning, of metaphysical reasoning in particular, are a really recurring important theme throughout the Critique of Pure Reason. It's a systematic probing of the limits of human mind rather than of its powers. And that second aspect, I think in part because cognitive scientists don't read Kant, has received a lot less attention, but is still equally interesting. So for example, if we look at the A and B preface of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is sort of going off on a rant about why is metaphysics doing so badly? Metaphysics is supposed to be the queen of sciences, and yet here we are. We just keep on rehashing the same debates. There's no progress, nothing. Whereas the natural sciences, they are making progress. They are providing a comprehensive picture of the world. Why is that? Now, rationalists such as Descartes thought it was possible to use your reason. And in this way, you could just think your way, like you could think everything. You could basically sit there disembodied or in your stove in winter, and you could think the whole world. You could think God, you could think you exist, and you could just use reason to do that. But Kant disagreed. He said this is an illicit use of reasoning, and we overstep the bounds of reasoning detailed in the Analytic. So he says, reason begins from principles whose use is unavoidable in the course of experience, and at the same time, sufficiently warranted by it. With these principles, it rises ever higher to more and more remote conditions. And he gives this really interesting metaphor of a dove. So you have this flying dove, and the dove thinks, if only I didn't have the air pressure, it would go even easier. But that's not true. The dove would not be able to fly if it weren't for the air pressure. And similarly, we need experience to ground us. If we don't have experience, we're just going to fly off to ever more remote metaphysical fancies that have just no bearing on reality. And so that's because reason does that, because our reason isn't always anchored in this way. And we frequently just go on and we don't let ourselves be anchored by reality. We get into what he calls the transcendental illusion. We have, in particular, says Kant, a quest for ultimate explanations. We want to know why things happen, why. And that gives rise to this reasoning error, namely the transcendental illusion, when we take a subjective necessity of a connection of our concepts for an objective necessity in the determination of things in themselves. This obviously echoes people like Hume, who've argued like, you see causal connection, you see A is always following B, you make a constant conjunction. And so you think, oh, well, this connection is really there, but maybe it's just something that's part of your experience. So we take subjective demands for the unification of thought to be objective characteristics of the thing itself. So going back to teleology, maybe there's no reason why. well, obviously you can have a causal explanation of why the pandemic happened. Like people, I mean, scientists are at this very moment trying to find out why it happened, like how could it happen? But it's not going to be an explanation along the lines of this is to teach humanity a lesson, clearly. Or can it? So I'll get into that metaphysical Natalie thing later on. So this is an illusion. Like you can't help but think happened for a reason. Like if something happens, it must be for a reason. So we are in this illusion that these things that order our experiences and help us make sense of the world, that we think those things really are an objective feature of reality. And we can't think ourselves out of it. Reflection is not going to stop us from falling into this illusion. Kant makes an analogy with optical illusions. He says, if you look out at the sky and you have the moon and it's low and the sky is much bigger than if it's higher in the sky, but actually you can measure and you can see that moon is exactly the same size. So you can't reason yourself out of it. Even if you think, oh yes, I have an illusion, it's not going to stop you from having that illusion. A very interesting prefiguring of the biases and heuristics literature that we start seeing in the 1970s and 80s with people like Tversky and Kahneman and so on. So it's natural, the transcendental illusion is natural and unavoidable. At the same time, and this is an interesting this is an interesting nuanced position. So on the one hand, it's bad because it makes us overstep the bounds of reason. On the other hand, it helps us to regulate our cognition. Now, if we apply that to the critique of judgment, where he talks about teleological reasoning, he says there that teleological thinking is a heuristic device. We conceptualize biological organisms, in particular animals and plants, as having natural purposes or Naturzweck. So on the one hand, the leaves too, though produced by the tree, also sustain it in turn, for the repeated defoliation would kill it, and its growth depends on their effect of the trunk. So people in the 18th century knew about photosynthesis. They did all sorts of experiments, basically depriving plants of leaves and then seeing, yeah, they die. A bit like they also did with birds and depriving them of oxygen. I somehow think the thing with the leaves is less cruel, but I don't know. So anyway, they knew this. And how do you make sense of that? Well, you explain it using teleology as a heuristic device. And here is very interestingly, he then makes this analogy with watches. Like he says, on the one hand, you might say, well, the tree leaves are a bit like the parts of a watch. And obviously this harkens to watch metaphors in natural theology, where you already see since the 17th century, and obviously Paley's watch on the heath is like the culmination of this watch analogy, but you see it a lot earlier. You see it in Nieuwentijd in the 17th century, for example. So nevertheless, he says there's a clear disanalogy. One gear in the watch does not produce another, still less does one watch produce watches. So there's clearly something different between the watch and the tree. And this also is a Humean idea, namely that you have a disanalogy between artifacts and organisms. And it's kind of interesting, I think, this is just a quick digression, but it's interesting that at some point Paley goes on to say, wouldn't it be even more amazing if our watch produced another watch? You'd say, wow, this is certainly designed. But Kant makes a very different conclusion. He says, it's not. Like, this is the whole thing. A watch is not like the leaf of a tree. But we have this teleological thinking, which is just a heuristic. It's a heuristic. It's a way that our minds structure our experience. So there is a lot of relevance of Kant for cognitive science. There's a lot of attention for the claim that the mind structures our experience. And we even see this today now with continued discussion on nativism, empiricism, embodied cognition, functionalism, and so on. But there is a lot less attention for the second part of his project, namely the limits of reasoning, except in the cognitive science of religion. So the idea about how far can our reason go? At what point do we overstep the bounds of reason? And I think cognitive science of religion does pay attention to that. Cognitive science of religion authors aim to explain, for example, how we have belief in souls and afterlife and gods from a naturalistic perspective. So even if there are no gods, no souls, no afterlife, how do people have such beliefs? Well, you appeal to the structuring features of the mind. So here's an example, well-known example, due to the work of Paul Bloom and other cognitive scientists. And he says, why do we believe that we have souls or minds? And why do we equate the mind with the soul? We don't always do that, by the way. So it's interestingly not in every culture. In many cultures, the mind and the soul are separate things. But if you do equate them, why is this? Well, he says, young children have different heuristics to think about physical objects and to think about mental objects or mental states. So they use different heuristics, and these different heuristics persist throughout adulthood. Like you have a different idea, like if a ball comes to you at great speed, it'll keep on going. But if a human runs towards you at great speed, then they might do something different, and you use different heuristics to explain the different ways these things move. So in order to make such explanations, we have these heuristics about non-living and living, and that's how eventually we come to the idea of souls and minds. Like we can think about what other people are thinking, even if they're not in our close proximity, and that helps us to think, for instance, about the minds of people who are dead. Like we can still attribute beliefs to a deceased grandparent, because, well, after all, we just use the same inference systems. So that is the kind of explanation that cognitive scientists of religion use. So they use the structuring features of the mind to think about why we make certain leaps. And they wonder, cognitive scientists of religion wonder, to what extent can we make those leaps? Now let's examine the case of teleology a bit more closely. Now, there are basically two kinds of studies on what is actually called by Deborah Kelemen promiscuous teleology. On the one hand, there are studies about life events, things that happen, things like the pandemic, but also things in your personal life. Banerjee and Bloom have studied this, and Haywood and Beering. On the other hand, there's sort of studies about explanations for things like rocks and clouds. But then about events. So it's interesting to note that if you ask people why, you ask them to write down all sorts of important life events, like they failed college in their first year, they got married, they got cancer, serious stuff. Then you ask them, okay, now why? Why did this happen? And it's interesting to note, and not so surprising, that in both these studies, committed theists offer more teleological explanations compared to atheists. They'd say, it was so I could learn this or that. It was so I could see this or that. It was because God was guiding me towards this or that. However, an interesting and unexpected finding was that a quarter of the atheist participants in, I think, both of these studies appealed to fate or the universe to explain these events. For example, here is a participant to whom something serious happened, like they had to basically care for somebody who was ill for a long time. I forgot the exact circumstances, but she said, I think this occurred as a way for the universe to show me that no matter what I thought my mission in life was, I was meant to be a person who lived my life for others and strives to make everything around me a little better and more kind and loving. And this was very interesting to see this sort of refrain among participants. So people spontaneously attribute teleology to life events. Now, the literature on teleology started somewhere in the 1980s, I think, with work by the cognitive scientist Frank Kyle. And Frank Kyle had this idea that children make an intuitive distinction between artifacts and natural objects by applying what he calls selective teleology. Selective teleology is the idea that young children will spontaneously think this pair of scissors is an object that has a purpose, whereas this cat is not. Like, I'm not going to grab my cat now, he wouldn't appreciate it, but this cat, imagine a cat, doesn't have a purpose. And they had to rise experiments that seem to show that. But Deborah Kelemen was just not convinced. And she rather argues, and I will look at some experiments in a moment about how she establishes this, that rather humans are from an early age promiscuously teleological. And what does she mean by that? Humans naturally exhibit a tendency to believe that objects, including natural objects such as clouds, trees, or mountains, serve a purpose. And later on, she even calls this tendency intuitive theism. Here's an immediate issue or worry when we're talking about promiscuous teleology. In philosophy of biology, there is continued discussion on what the proper bounds of teleology are. You keep on having this discussion. You see it in Meyer, you see it in Okasha, you see it in Hull, in Roos, in Monod, all these other people I mentioned earlier. So, for example, Samir Okasha, in his book on agents in 2018, uses teleology as a fundamental feature of agency. So he defines an agent as follows. An agent is something that has goal-directedness, that has behavioral flexibility, and it has adaptedness. And you see very clearly here, goal-directedness is a feature for agency. And actually that discussion isn't completely solved. We haven't sorted out to what extent teleology is illicit. So it seems a bit premature then to say that people's thinking is being promiscuously teleological or not is a bit premature. Presumably though, and we'll look in a moment at whether this works, Kelemen restricts this to fairly what she thinks are unproblematic cases where it seems clear to everybody, or does it, that the teleology is unwarranted. In 1999, two papers published by Kelemen. The first paper, she asked children of age 5 to about 10 and adults questions like, why are there lions? Are lions for something, or are they just there? And the children would say, lions are for something. And they'd offer all sorts of things, like lions are to go in the zoo. Very cute explanation. Lions, why are they there? Well, obviously to go in the zoo. Why are there mountains? Are they there just because they are, or for some reason? Well, mountains are there for a reason. They're for us to climb on. Whereas adults, they would just say, lions are just there, or mountains are just there. Now, the problem is a bit with this experimental setup that children might just choose the for a reason answer because it just sounds cooler or it's more interesting. So to try to control for that, she did a second series of experiments where she gave explanations that children had to choose from. So she went to American children and adults, also in the Boston area, and she'd ask them, why are there rocks? Explanation 1, rocks are pointy because bits of stuff piled up on top of one another for a long time. Explanation 2, rocks are pointy so that animals wouldn't sit on them and smash them. Explanation 3, rocks are pointy so that animals could scratch on them when they got itchy. Now you wonder, there's two teleological explanations there, but the reason is simply that she wondered whether there was a difference between self-serving and other-serving teleological explanations, but that didn't seem to give any significant effect, so that was later dropped, but in this study you have it. Now here you have children ages about 5 or 6 to 10. They are promiscuously teleological. So they will say, they will agree, yes, rocks are pointy so that animals wouldn't sit on them and smash them. Clouds are there for raining and other such things. Trees have leaves so that animals can eat them and so on. Whereas adults would only have teleology for parts of animals, such as a giraffe has a neck, long neck, so it can reach leaves higher up and stuff like that. So in that respect, Kelemen disproved or gave strong evidence against Kyle's hypothesis that teleology is selective. Now you might say, okay, we grow out of it. Eventually, we learn to correctly apply teleology when it matters. But actually, she then went on to show that promiscuous teleology persists. So in adults, if you are given really quick, you have to quickly decide, like, is the ozone layer there to protect us from UV radiation, or is it there because of, fill in, I forgot what, it says something about my mind that I can't remember what the mechanistic explanation was. In older adults with Alzheimer's, you also see it. So in these speeded judgment tests, people will go towards incorrect teleological explanations and not towards incorrect mechanistic explanations. In older adults with Alzheimer's, you see it. Non-Western studies, there's a lot less work on teleology in non-Western populations. There's one interesting study, there's a couple, by Josh Rothman, who was a postdoc with Deborah Kelemen, where he investigated what Chinese adults do in terms of teleological explanations under speeded conditions and then under normal conditions. And all the participants said they were atheists. And we know that there is a strong effect of theism on teleology. It increases teleological thinking. Nevertheless, under speed, they will still incorrectly endorse explanations such as the Earth has an ozone layer to protect it from UV radiation. So it seems that it's not just a Western phenomenon, you can see it across cultures. Now, why don't we all make teleological explanations all the time? Well, according to Kelemen, this is because of education. Western education provides us with mechanistic explanations, and those mechanistic explanations help us to give us something else. So here's an interesting study. I think it was done in Hungary. It must have been done in Hungary, where they looked at two populations of Romani adults. They looked at adults who had followed school, and they looked at adults who hadn't followed regularly school. So some people are enrolled of the Romani population in Hungary are regularly enrolled in school and others aren't. And then just asking them questions about, is the sun there to give us warmth, or is the sun there because it's a big ball of hydrogen turning into, and interestingly, the Romani adults who had followed school basically reasoned as unteleologically as other people from the Hungarian general population, whereas those who hadn't followed school, they thought very teleologically. It was a big difference. So, best explanation, given that the populations are otherwise very similar, is that the education makes a big difference. And similarly, there is significantly, this is in the Boston area, among adults with no university diploma, adults with a bachelor's in university, and then adults with a humanities PhD, and then adults with a STEM PhD. And so again, they were asked under normal and speeded conditions, all sorts of questions about why certain things are the way they are. And interestingly, the higher your degree, the less teleologically you think. One surprising factor was that actually humanities PhD holders thought about as unteleologically as STEM PhD holders. Again, what explains for that? Well, there must be something about Western education. So Kelemen and her lab hypothesize, there must be something about what the education does, it gives us alternative explanations. Like you think, oh, why are there mountains? And you'll spontaneously go for climbing or, because of animals scratching their backs on them or whatever. But then once you learn about geology, then you have a different explanation. You have about plate tectonics and mountains rising up, and you then basically have that explanation available, so you don't have to resort to the teleological explanation. The teleological explanation is the default. The mechanistic explanation we learn through education is not the default, it's something we sort of, and that explains why under speeded conditions, why under people who develop Alzheimer's, they don't have those explanations available easily or anymore. And so they revert to the default, which is the teleological explanation. So that's sort of a state of the literature. But here I want to put some grave concerns. Like, I think the literature is great and it replicates well and so on. And that's recently a problem, like, does the research replicate? But this research does. But the problem remains that I think that Kelemen imports the normative into something purely descriptive. Now, Al-Qayyam and Evans have argued in a big BBS paper that empirical evidence cannot arbitrate between competing normative theories. It just can't. It's not made for that. Like, you can't empirically check whether, this normative theory is correct or this normative theory is correct purely with empirical evidence. I don't even want to put a sort of strong G.E. Moore is old fallacy stance there. I think even if you think that there are naturalistic ways to look at the normative, I think that indeed this is a case of overstepping. So at best, empirical evidence can be used to establish a certain cognitive tendency. In this case, it's a tendency to attribute teleology to a wide range of domains. And nevertheless, we see this in a lot of literature, intrusion of the normative upon the descriptive. Take all the heuristics and bias literature. Take the cognitive reflection tests. Like, so this is the test where you go something like, okay, a lily pads double in size every day, and on the 48th day, they cover the entire lake. So when was half the lake covered, and people will go something like, maybe not now, maybe now we can all think exponential growth, maybe now this is really ingrained in our minds, but prior to 2020, people would say, oh, well, it was half at day 24, or it was half at day 30 something. Nope, wrong, it's at date 47. And so you make all these normative assumptions about how people who are cleverer, who don't get themselves be trapped by these things, and about how people have biases and these biases are bad, etc. So you see this kind of intrusion of the normative upon a purely descriptive result very, very often. And I think that something similar is going on in the teleology studies. Now, you require a metaphysical assumption to actually claim that the teleology is illicit. Now, this might sound a bit silly to say, how do we know that mountains are not there for climbing? For all we know, they might. So obviously, I don't think many people, not even many theists, would say that mountains are there for climbing. But nevertheless, you do make a metaphysical extra assumption there that is sort of playing at the background. There are many, many religious traditions. There's Gaia beliefs that actually do say there is something like teleology in nature. Another thing that sometimes bothers me is that the causal explanation in these experiments is often wrong. So the normatively correct answer about why are rocks pointy is supposed to be rocks are pointy because bits of stuff piled upon one another for a long period of time. Now, I'm not a geologist, but this is not why rocks are pointy. This is just not why rocks are pointy. So how can you say that the one thing is like the right causal, mechanistic, educated, Western, etc. thing to do, and the other thing is illicit, promiscuous teleology? Now, I sort of make it a bit caricaturing, and it doesn't quite sound that bad, but I worry that a lot of this teleology literature goes in that direction. And supporting my worries is the fact that studies by Elisa Janeveld and colleagues indeed show that belief in supernatural agency, particularly and even in an agential nature, so-called Gaia beliefs, predict teleological tendencies in educated adults, including in physical scientists and humanities scholars. And this is a very interesting and surprising result. And I remember once at a conference dinner, I was talking to Deborah Kelemen about this very phenomenon. And she said, yes, I am surprised how many physical scientists have Gaia beliefs. Like, it's not that they would sort of conscientiously say, the world is Gaia or something, but they have this belief that the world is actually an agent, that Mother Nature is an agent. She saw this with many of her participants, and they would honestly believe that something like the pandemic is really nature's way of wake up calling us. So this is an interesting sort of religious belief, of more maybe a spiritual belief, because it's not that they're part of some sort of Gaia church, that is actually quite common among physical scientists. And that was really a surprise. So in this study, in this particular study, because I'm now referring to her earlier studies in Boston, you have similar things. So Finland is a very secular country. And in this study, people were just shown very simple things, like you were shown a pair of scissors, a maple leaf, an apple, a tiger, just things like that. You saw pictures, and then you had to choose between this was made for a purpose or this was not made for a purpose. Now, Finnish religious participants already in 25% of the trials, where it's not an artifact, but something like a maple leaf or an apple, would say made for a purpose. And this is compared to a very low number, I forgot exactly how much, but it's less than 10% in non-religious participants. And it goes up to 41% under time pressure. So it seems that if religion influences people's endorsement of these teleological explanations, and if it is the case that physical scientists, that a substantial number of them have sort of agential nature beliefs, then I think it is probably better to call this broad scope teleology rather than promiscuous teleology. It could be described as the tendency to accept teleological explanations that are at odds with Western science. So I think that sort of sounds descriptive enough, doesn't sort of import all sorts of normative assumptions into it. So you could think about other criticisms to promiscuous teleology. If children really are promiscuously teleological, it seems that children are confused about the distinction between animals and artifacts, or between living and non-living things. But even infants grasp this distinction. So you have these studies, duck and truck studies, where, you know, infants see something appear and disappear. And if it's something that is an artifact versus a biological entity, they can see that difference. Moreover, the promiscuous teleology hypothesis seems to assume that Western education is the only way by which people learn to limit teleological reasoning to the appropriate domain of artifacts and perhaps parts of organisms. Isn't that great? Like, aren't we happy and grateful for Western education to bring us all that? However, there is significant cross-cultural evidence to show that people from non-Western cultures have sophisticated biological knowledge, such as ethnobiology. In many cases, it's better for the particular. It is often just better than what Western lay people. Let's be serious. If you walk around, if you're anywhere like me, you see trees. Do you know what trees they are? You probably don't. But in lots of small-scale societies, indigenous societies, people in fact do know all the plants and animals, etc., etc. And they can make really sophisticated thinking about what these plants can be used for and how they relate to each other. And if people really were so intuitively, promiscuously teleological, how could they do it? There is also a bit of a minority voice that I do want to put here, namely Greif and colleagues. Greif and colleagues are basically, they have argued against the promiscuous teleology hypothesis, and they think it's just an artifact of putting people on the spot, making them choose, forced choice between different interpretations. So what they did was they just gave children pictures of really unfamiliar animals, such as okapis and civets and other such really freaky animals that a child of 5 would probably not have seen. And then they showed them pictures of really unusual looking artifacts, such as the krullet, which makes Play-Doh balls, or the garflong, which flattens towels. These are all not real English words. And then they asked those children, okay, ask us anything about this object. What do you want to know? And the children would ask about the animals, things like, what does it eat? Where does it live? What sound does it make? And about the artifacts, they would ask, what is it for, among others. They never asked for an animal, what is it for? Never, ever. So that paradigm, it's a bit different from the way that Kelemen presents it, but does suggest that children will not spontaneously ask what an animal is for. So countering this idea of promiscuous teleology is the hypothesis by Bethany Oyaleto and colleagues that people intuitively have what they call relational deictic teleology. which is teleological thinking about nature that reflects relational reasoning about perspectival relations among living things and their environment. So here's an example. You have the Western scrub jay, a really cool blue bird that sometimes sits in my garden, and they are famous for hiding food. So they hide food, they burrow it, they hide live, like insects and the like, they kill that and they put it in, and they also hide pine seeds. Now, it turns out that due to air pollution and sound pollution, they left their native pine tree forests in California. But the problem is they hide those pines, they can't all find them back. So they were a major contributor to pine forest regeneration. And now the pine forests are in trouble because the blue jay is not there. So the question is, what are scrub jays for? Well, obviously they're there to help pollinate and to help regenerate pine forests. So you can say that in a kind of relational way without it being illicit or bad, according to Oyaleto and colleagues. So in the light of all this discussion, I want to just briefly turn back to Kant. How do Kant's two claims about teleology hold up? Remember, there was a negative view about teleology being unwarranted. It's a heuristic with which you overstep the bounds of reason and you attribute to nature what actually is just something in your mind. But he also has a positive view of teleology as something that helps us to structure our experience. What you had situating Kant. Prior to Kant, you had the medieval consensus in which Aristotle was super important, and Aristotle's theory of causation with final causes was widely used until the late Middle Ages because it explains adaptiveness in nature. So this is something along the following lines. Why are our incisors differently shaped from our molars? Well, clearly because our molars do something different from our incisors, and the shape is explained by the function. So this is a teleological explanation. And the interesting thing is you don't require any external agents. So Aquinas says this explicitly, referencing an idea by Ibn Sina or Avicenna, that, if you even have a musician who can play without sort of consciously thinking about it, then nature can bring about these teleologies without any conscious or external agent. But in the 17th century, people were all impressed with what was happening in physics. And in physics, you had universal laws of nature. So you don't have like mini causes anymore. You just have covering laws. So why does something fall? In Aristotle's view, well, something falls because it has the element of earth, and earth has a natural tendency, inherent tendency to go downwards. That all went away. Now things fall because of gravity, which is a universal law. The problem with this is that the mechanistic worldview didn't quite fit the life sciences. All of a sudden, you have to explain still things like molars and incisors, and now you can't sort of have these kind of inherent mini causations or mini teleologies. Now you have to use these covering laws. How are you going to do that? It's a huge problem, and you actually see this in the critique of judgment. There were some attempts at a solution, for example, the Göttingen school. So you have Blumenbach, who has this idea of the Bildungsstrieb, like, why are molars shaped the way they are? Well, because of, there is some sort of Newtonian-like laws governing that. And that explains it. So you have something like Newtonian forces, but then in biology. But it's not clear whether this works. Because prior to evolutionary theory, you only had transmutation. It didn't give you any mechanism for why this was supposed to work. So you didn't have selective retention of characteristics. You didn't have that in the 18th century. And Kant was very skeptical about the Newtonian project for physics, but he was skeptical about Blumenbach's theory, for which he was familiar. So he says, well, this Bildungsstrieb, it's not explaining actual reality. It's not really... the best it can do is a heuristic device. So he says natural purpose is not a constitutive concept, either of understanding or of reason. So actually, even if you reason properly, then you shouldn't use something like the Bildungsstrieb. So he refused to recognize biology as part of the sciences, in German Wissenschaft, natural sciences. At most, it was something like a Naturlehre, which is a connection of generalizations. And here comes, like, if you've got like one quote from the Critique of Judgments, probably this: we may boldly state that it is absurd for human beings to even attempt it or to hope that perhaps one day another Newton might arise who would explain to us in terms of natural laws, unordered by any intention, how even a mere blade of grass is produced. So lots of discussion on this quote, lots of discussion. Would evolutionary biology satisfy Kant? Would he say, oh yeah, sure, now you guys are a Wissenschaft? We don't quite know if that's the case. And it doesn't really matter that much for thinking about Kant's ideas about teleology and how they hold up in the light of cognitive science. Because interestingly, Kant also looked at another solution. So you have the solution of, okay, once you have no Aristotelianism anymore, how are we going to deal with teleology? Like, what do we make of? Clearly, it seems that in natural organism, there's something like teleology. One solution is to have a naturalistic explanation, and that you have in things like Bildungsstreep, and then later in Darwin. The other solution is non-natural, and that is natural theology. So God made it the case that, fish have fins and that the eye is so wonderfully designed. And you see it in Newton, Ted, Paley, many other people. But Kant famously, obviously, didn't like these explanations, and he already took them down in the Critique of Pure Reason and Critique of Judgment. He worries about circularity. If we introduce the concept of God into the context of natural science in order to make the purposiveness in nature explicable, and then in turn use this purposiveness to prove that there is a God, then neither natural science nor theology is intrinsically firm. A vicious circle makes both uncertain because they have allowed their boundaries to overlap. So here's the problem. On the one hand, you introduce God to make sense of teleology, because how else can you make sense of it? But then on the other hand, you look at, say, a fish, and you look at the fins, and you say, wow, that's very fluid dynamic. And you say, it must be God who did it. Then you're just using God in two ways. And it kind of makes the whole thing viciously circular. And I think Kant is right that this makes it viciously circular. And it's interesting that the Aristotelians avoided that entirely because they allowed for internal teleologies that didn't require design. So to briefly conclude, I think that, so I started out with Kant's views on teleology and transcendental illusions, and then I looked at contemporary cognitive science of religion. And notably, I'm interested in this idea about that there are certain limits to our reasoning, and that if we go beyond those limits to still try to make sense of the world, that we fall into what he calls the transcendental illusion. And I've argued that you see that in contemporary cognitive science of religion with the Kelemen lab, where there is this claim for promiscuous teleology, where allegedly human teleological thinking would overstep the bounds of what we can reasonably do. I've talked a bit about the problems of importing the normative into the descriptive. And taking a Kantian perspective, you could argue that intuitive teleology regulates and structures our cognition by helping making sense of biological relationships and functions. And even though, if you look at ecological thinking, while the ozone layer is probably not there to protect us from harmful UV radiation, unless, theism or Gaia beliefs or whatever are true, it still seems that incorrect or correct if you want to make that claim. And unlike the Kelemen lab, I can do that because I'm a philosopher and we can just say basically anything. Can say, well, look, even if it is incorrect, it still helps us to capture an actual relationship between the ozone layer and life on Earth. And so I think that it's interesting if we just get a bit more cognizant about how our normative ideas influence our descriptions of what's happening in cognitive psychology experiments, that this sort of Kantian framework about thinking about the limits of reason could help us to do that further. Thank you.